Good evening. We're ready to start Maseches Shekalim, Daf Gimel, and we are at the top of Daf Gimel Amud Aleph. A lot of words, a lot of material. So let's jump right in. We are on the top line of Gimel Amud Aleph, quoting back to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah on Daf Beis Amud Aleph, as we opened up the Masechta, spoke about what we do on Aleph Adar and on Chamisha Sarba Adar. And on Chamisha Sarba Adar, it said the line that we, if you look back at the Mishnah, it says that we're Koran Samagil B'Krachim, which we spoke about. And then it said in Mesaktin es Hadrachim es Harachovos v'chule, and that's what we're going to start out with here. Top line Gimel Amud Aleph says the Gemara as follows: Mesaktin es Hadrachim es Harachovos v'esemikvos hamayim v'osin kol tzorchei harabim. What are tzorchei harabim? What is that referring to? So the Gemara says as follows: Elu hein tzorchei harabim. 3 lines down. What do we do on this day, the 15th of the month of Adar? Done in Dine Mamonos v'Dine Nefashos. Serious court cases were held on that day. Dine Makos as well. The cases where people were potentially obligated to get the punishment of makos, upodin, and they would redeem erchin v'charamim hekdeshos, 3 different types of financial commitments and dedications to the Beis Hamikdash. Erchin specifically is that you would give the erech, the value of a particular person. It would a particular math equation, as at this age, this gender, whatever it would be, and that's how much it would cost. Charamim and hekdeshos, different types of gifts to the mikdash. Umashkin es hasota machlokes here. What does that mean? Was this the day when all of the sotas were tested? Were their cases adjudicated or just discussed on those days? Machlokes Rishonim here. The sarfin es hapar, the paraduma was burned on that day. But orphan egla arufa, had there been a case of an egla arufa where there was a person who died between 2 cities and the land in between was fallow and it was possibly near water, the egla arufa, they would break the neck on that day. The rotzen eved ivri, if there was a case where an eved wanted to become a permanent slave, that's what the pasuk says. I think where is that mishpatim? I think that's where it is. So then that would be the day that they would do that. They would do taras hamitzora that day. They used to collect water during the winter months from the rainwater in Eretz Yisrael, because when it comes springtime, there's really no rain for 6 months, and they had to find a way to make sure that they had, drinkable water for the rest of the year. So what they would do is they would save them in a cistern with a lock, and when it came to the 15th of Adar, right at the beginning of spring, they would open up the locks, me'al gabi hamayim ve'ein machzirin osan, and of the brisa of what it means tzorchei rabim that was done on the 15th of Adar. Very busy day, very, very busy day. Court cases right and left, a very dramatic scene. Taman Taninan, same as Tanan Hasam, we have a Mishnah over there. This Mishnah is found in Maseches Moed Katan. And this Mishnah, Maseches Moed Katan, was discussing Sukkot. We are discussing right before Pesach. This was discussing Sukkot. So what's the question? Says the Gemara, Mashkin Beis Hashplachin, you were allowed to irrigate during Chol HaMoed, Umitzayin al HaKvaros. And you would be Mitzayin, you'd make a mark of where the Kvaros were. But that's strange because the Gemara says, Lo Kvar Tzayinu Adar. What about Me'adar? What about our Mishnah? If you look back in our Mishnah, we spoke about this already, that it says in our Mishnah that you were mitzayin in Esakvaros. So why does it have to be twice a year? You said it in Moed Katan, and you're saying it here again. By Moed Katan, we were talking about Sukkot time, and here we're talking about Pesach time, yet it seems that both would need to be the case. Says the Gemara, V'ti pater, from the Hebrew word pitaron. What's the solution here? She yorad shetef shel geshamim v'shatva. We're talking about a time where there was a huge landslide of rain, and it wiped away the limestone, which they used to create these demarcations to indicate where the Beis HaKvaros were, where the bodies were in particular. We'll see in a minute a little bit more detail, but some of the Rishonim write that the reason why we use limestone is because if you've ever seen limestone, it has this white kind of textured look to it, and according to some Rishonim, it looks like bone, which is a little bit of a detailed comparison, to say the least. And what the Gemara was saying was that we were concerned that the Kohanim might mistake where they are. So we wanted to make sure that they knew that this place, lime, looks like the bone, and therefore that was the type of marker that they used. So then we're going to get into that in a little bit. But the Gemara asks another question from Moed Katan. In Moed Katan, what else does it say? At the 2 dots, 10 lines down, Gimel Amud Aleph, the Mishnah in Moed Katan writes, quoted here, V'yotzin afal kilaim, you also go out for the kilaim. What do you mean? Lo kvar yotzim Adar. We had that in our Mishnah. They already went out to check on the kilaim in the month of Adar. Why is it happening again later in the year? Says the Gemara, Tipater, how do we solve this problem? It was a dark year, quote unquote. The growth in Adar was not noticeable in such a year. When the growth in Adar is not noticeable, you got to go out many months later to make sure that there's no kilaim. And that's how we explain that. Minayin, how do we know, let's see, how do we know that we need to make a marker for the Kohanim to not become tamei mace. We know that they can't become tamei mace. That's pasha. That those are psukim and chumash. That for sure we know. But we have to make an effort on our own. What's our hishtadlus to make sure that the kohanim are safe? So our cemeteries are particularly mesudar. If there's a need for a kohen to be there, they can stand outside. The pathways are very clear, as long as it's been a place that's been taken care of. So whatever the case may be, I know that there are kohanim here in the community who have officiated at funerals before standing outside. Fine, because it's very clear. But what about back in the day where we're below the frost line, we're 6 feet down, we're making sure that the bodies don't move that much. But back in the day, it wasn't like that. Nowadays they're in very heavy metal caskets in addition to the pine box. It says a lot of weight. It's not going anywhere. It's not very far at least. So where does that obligation come from? There's two different approaches in the Gemara. Here's approach number one, Rebbe Brachia and Rabbi Yaakov bar Bas Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov, the son of the daughter of Yaakov. The Rishonim here point out, we saw this once in another Masechta, that Rabbi Yaakov's father was not worth mentioning. So he was referred to as the son of the daughter of the grandfather, which was his own namesake, but he was named after someone who wasn't so Gishmak. He was named after someone Gishmak. His father was not Gishmak, apparently. And that was B'Shem Rabbi Chunya Divras Chivrin, who was from that place of Divras Chivrin, and Rabbi Yosa. And Amrila, some say it was other people. Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha B'Shem Rabbi Chunya Divras Chivrin, Rabbi Chizkiah, Rabbi Uziel Berei, the Rabbi Chunya Divras Chivrin, B'Shem Rabbi Chunya Divras Chivrin, whoever was the author of the following comment. Remember our question. How do we know that we're obligated to make it tziyun, that we're obligated to make a very clear indicator of where a mace lies? So it says the Gemara, it's based on a pasuk, v'tamei tamei yikra. That's what a pasuk says in regards to a tarua. I'll read the whole pasuk. V'hatzarua asher bo hanega v'gadav yeferumim v'rosho yefarua v'al safam ya'ateh v'tamei tamei yikra. We should say about him, he's tamei. Why were we saying about him, he's a tamei? Because we don't want him to be matame other things. People will keep a distance. Fine, very good. So then the same idea applies here. People will say, get away. So we're extrapolating from the world of tsarua to the world of tuma. Why the tziyun? Because we want people to be careful. We want to make sure that the kohanim are not, there's 100 nafkaminas, but the one that's going to be practical for today is to be soref truma. We know, of course, that a kohen's allowed to eat truma, but we don't want to have to be soref truma. If truma becomes tameh, that's a problem. If it becomes tameh, we have to burn it. But we don't want it to become tameh. So let's say that someone's buried on the side of the road, which back in the day may not have been so uncommon. I don't know what the standards were. The pictures of old that we've all seen in the movies is that there are these little synagogues with a little, with a little cemetery behind. I don't know how prevalent that was historically in the times of the Gemara, but based on the Shnei Shvilim case that we're all familiar with, that we know there was a mace buried right across the road. We've had a number of cases in Shas so far. So it was not a very Masudar type of burial. So we want to make sure that the Kohanim don't become Tameh, or that the Truma that they're carrying doesn't become Tameh. And then it would then need to be burned. That's answer number one. Answer number two, 1/3 of the way down. Rav Ila b'Shem Rav Shmuel bar Nachman. It's because of a pasuk. Ve'avruha overim be'eretz ve'ra'a etzem adam uvana etzlo tzion. We see that there's a person there, there's bone there. Uvana etzlo tzion, and we should build next to it a marker. Now let's analyze many parts of the pasuk. Etzem, when you see the bone, what does that mean? If you see a bone, mikan shemitzayin al ha'atzamos. Once you see a bone that's there, you're obligated straight up. You see a bone there, you should find some lime right away, limestone, and just paint a picture for the Kohanim to know what's going on. Next word in the pasuk that we're going to analyze, Adam. Mikan shemitzayin al hashidra v'hagulgolas. This is the big discussion in the Rishonim. We know that etzem kisaora is whatever the shiur mark for tumas mace, but what's considered a mace? So some of the Rishonim write that it's when the spine and the skull are intact. Some say even when they're not intact, but together, one or the other. Big shita is big machlokas in the Rishonim there, and that's how we would define an adam, by a shidra and golgolas, by the spine and by the skull. Uvana, and what you should do is you should build mikan shemetzayin al gabe even kavua. One should make a marker on a stone that's kavua, that's stuck in the ground. The Gemara here emphasizes this point a little bit further. Omer at al gabe even tulusha. Had it been that it was different, that we were talking about a loose stone, well, that would not be a good idea. Because then, if it's a loose stone, well, then the stone's going to move. It's going to have the limestone marking on it, and people are going to think there's a mace under there, and then you're going to be soref truma without any good reason at all. So you should not be putting limestone on a loose kever. I remember many years ago when I was in Poland, I went on March of the Living. I went twice to Poland, and we spent a while in the Warsaw Cemetery cleaning up. It was disgusting. It was a bizayon. It was a mess. and there were so a lot of the tombstones were fallen over or pushed over. I don't know whichever one it was. So there, you cannot start putting markers on it of the limestone because that we would make an assumption that underneath that is a mace. If you're a Kohen holding truma, you're going to be sorry truma with no good reason at all. There's no mace everywhere. It has to be be'evan kavua, and that's this piece of the pasuk. The pasuk continues about 10 lines before the second Mishnah. Says the Gemara etzlo. What does it mean etzlo? Lemakom tahara. We put the marker in a place where itself is tahor. Underneath that marker itself really is tahor. It's the beginning of the tahara place. So let's say that the right side of the Gemara is a mace. So then they'd make the marker just outside the mace area, so that if you stood over that, in theory, we'll see later that this is not Lamaisa, but that is what the pasuk says, that it's low. We really should try to put it so that the person would be tahor, that the Kohen would be tahor if he stood by that marker. Next part of the pasuk says Thion, that you should be making a mark, mikan l'tzayin. So this whole pasuk is basically indicating it's a second answer to our question. The first answer to our question was from the tzarua, tamei tamei. We need to make sure that all the kohanim know that this is a place where there's a mace, and because this is a place where there's a mace, you should be careful. We don't want to burn truma necessarily. And the second answer is based on a pasuk, and this is the diun in the Rishonim, because the first answer seems to possibly even indicate a din d'oraisa, quoting a pasuk in Chumash, and the second one is not a pasuk in Chumash. Where is this second pasuk from? Let's just get the quote here. I don't think it's in Chumash, it's in Yechezkel. So if the first pasuk is here, some Rishonim hold that there may be a din d'oraisa. We know, of course, that there's a mitzvah to bury a person. That's for sure true. And is this a part of that? So the Rishonim are done in this particular case. And let's talk about a few applications of the halachos that we've just learned. Umatza even achas mitzuyenes. What if you find one stone that is in fact marked? So we should fear that it's on top of the body. Even though we don't normally keep a stone on top of the body. If one was under an umbrella that also was over this stone, tame. Ani Omer, what is my concern? Mace mitzuyan b'haya nasun tachta, that it was just put in the wrong place. So much for the drasha of etzlo, that wherever you put the mark is taka tahor. That doesn't seem to be the case. We are halachically concerned about that, and that's quoted in the Rambam. Hayu shtayim, if there were two stones, one on seemingly each side of the kever, so then hama'ahil halehen tahor v'nein tameh, then to be ma'ahil, to have a tent over, to have an ohel over the stone, and you on the other side as a kohen, that would be fine because there's two. So the implication is that the mace is in the middle. Very good. Tahor uveinehen tameh, and then in between, that would be a problem if you were in between the stones. But if there's two stones as markers, and we can assume that there's no mace under them and that the mace is in between them. And im hayachoresh ben atzayim, had it been that there was plowing that was done in between the two stones and there was no mace to be found, then harehein ki yechidios, then the connection between these two is now separated, it's severed, and each one is treated like we started a few lines ago. Ki yechidios, it's like one stone, benehen and tahor. Beinehen tahor, excuse me. In between the two stones would be tahor, because we just plowed the ground there, so we know that there's no mace there. Usvivo sehen tameh, and are surrounding it, meaning each of those stones underneath that, or al gabehen, some of them are forshim right here, that in fact would be tameh, because each of the stones would be treated in isolation. They're no longer connected because they plowed in between and there was no mace in between. And then says the Gemara, fascinating line, in mitzayin al habasar, we do not make a line of demarcation of where the mace is based on flesh. Afal pita, when there's a kazayis of flesh, that it's matame, but we don't make the line of demarcation based on flesh. Says the Gemara, Shemanis akel basar, because in due time, that's the way the world works. In due time, the basar will be nis akel, the flesh of the mace will decompose, and it will no longer be there. So says the Gemara, Rev Yuta bar Shunam ba'a kumi Rev Mana. Rev Yusta, the son of Shunam, asked a question, kumi, in front of Rev Mana, velo nimta betame taros l'mafreya. That's a big problem. If you don't put the line of demarcation by the flesh, then let's say a Kohen is holding truma and he walks over the flesh, but not over the bone. So that's a big problem, because today, before the decomposition, then you should be tamei. Then the truma should be tmeya. It says the Gemara, what's his response? He says, Amar le, mutav sheiskalkulu bo l'shava iskalkulu bo l'olam. You're right that it could cause for problems. You're right. Is that if you walk over the flesh and it's a kazayis basar, that could be a problem. But that's short term, because once the flesh decomposes, we're going to be back to the bones being, and that takes much, 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 much longer to decompose. That's going to be a whole different story. And therefore, says the Gemara, that we would rather focus on the long term, which is placing the lines of demarcation by the skeleton itself and not by the flesh, because the flesh will go away. Afal pi, that you're right, that there's a small chance that a kohen could bring truma right over the fleshy areas and not over the skeleton itself, in which case, yeah, the truma should have been burnt, but this would be preferred. Halfway down, Daf Gimel Amud Aleph, Halacha Beis, and a new Mishnah. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Birishona hayu okrinu mashlichin lifneihem. This is a discussion about kilayim. In the beginning, what would happen is when people were to go check in the fields, let's say that someone goes into your field and there were some kilayim. So what they would do is they would tear out the kilayim and solve the problem. Misharabu over avera, and people started enjoying this, as we'll see in the Gemara. Great, thank you for weeding out my problems. You did my work for me. I don't have to garden today. You did everything I needed to do. Got rid of my kilayim. So Misharabu over avera hayu mashlichin l'drachim. Then they would throw it out in the street, and still people didn't mind that either. And then finally, hiskinu shahayu mafkir and eskol asadeh. Finally, the Chachamim took the power into their own hands to be mafkir the whole sadeh. This is a principle in halacha called hefker bezdin hefker, that a bezdin has a power to be mafkir someone's properties. We'll see today in the Gemara Mar Mekomos for that. How do we know that the Chachamim have the power to say hefker bezdin hefker? That's a huge amount of power to say that someone's private property is hefker. That's incredible. Just think about that. That's my house. It's like, the government legally, they like take a lien if I don't pay my taxes. Like they take something of mine. So there's a halachic system for that as well. And it could be just as simple as you violating a din of kilayim. And then in such cases, hefker bezdin hefker. And we'll discuss that very shortly.
Would that be anything like eminent domain?
I don't know what that means.
Eminent domain? The government takes over your house. They take your property.
I guess, yeah. I don't know. I'm not holding. I guess so. I'm hearing from others. Yeah, it could be. I don't know. So the Gemara here opens up 4 lines into the new section of the Gemara here, halfway down. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. What did Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yehuda was the opening of our Mishnah. So it says the Gemara as follows: Tani, Amar Rabbi Yehuda. There's another brisa that gives a little more color, a little more detail than what our Mishnah says. Our Mishnah said that Barishona in the beginning they would just tear out the kilayim. And then the second phase of our Mishnah said that they would throw it on the street. And the third case was hefker bezdin hefker. So here the Gemara explains what's going on. Tani, Amar Rabbi Yehuda berishona hayu okrinu mashlichin lifnei, and they would tear it out and throw it in front of the balabas and saying, you're not taking care of your garden. You can't have kilei kerem. That's aser. So then, v'hayu smechin shteis machos. The balabatim were thrilled. Thank you so much for coming over. You just did all my work for me. What was the achas shahayu menachshin sadosein? They would come in and they would tear out all the bad parts of their field, make it halachically viable again. V'achas shahayu nehanin min kilayim, and as well, these kilayim you're allowed to have hana from kilayim. They give it to their animals as feed, whatever the case may be. They were thrilled about it. Misharabu over avera, when people realize this is gishmak. All I have to do is grow a little kilayim. Bezdin's going to send over some inspectors, and they're going to do all the work for me. This is great. This says the Gemara, Mishrabu over avera hay mashlichan ala drachim. But still, afal pikan, even when people would throw it in the street, hayu smechin, they were still happy. Shahi menachshim b'sadoten l'chol hapachos. They're still weeding out the kilayim from my field, and I don't have to do all the work. This is great. This is great. Hiskinu. Finally, the Chachamim put into place sheyehu mafkirin kol hasadek hula. Finally, it reached the point where people who were over avera, where they were really pushing the limits of kilayim. So under those circumstances, the halacha is that the Chachamim then had the power to be mafkir kol hasadek hula, to say you no longer own your own field. Anyone can come take from your field. Anihim, whoever it is, it's hefker, it's mamash hefker. Anyone can take it. So again, that's a very powerful halachic mechanism, and we are going to get into that. It says the Gemara 2/3 of the way down. Minayin shehefker bezdin hefker. How do we know that that's true? And we'll see 2 different approaches in the Gemara today. Number 1, dichsiv, a pasuk. The pasuk says, "V'chol asher lo yavo l'shloshes hayamim ba'atzas asarim v'hazekanim yacharam kol rechusho." The wise ones will be yacharam kol rechusho. They'll make you ownerless over your property. Who yivdal mi kahal hagola. Fine. How do we know that in such a case you'd be pater from meiser? Well, if you don't own your property, you're not obligated in meiser. How do we know that the Chachamim can go quite that far? Says the Gemara, because Rabbi Yonasan bereid Rabbi Yitzchak bar Acha shamala min hada. He heard that it's from here. Ein me'aber nes hashana lo b'shvis v'lo b'motzei shvis. When we were following Shemitah, the halacha was that you could not be ma'aber the shana. You could not add in a second adar in the year of Shemitah itself. And you also could not add one in the year after Shemitah. So year 7, and then again year 1 in the next cycle. year 7 of the Shemitah cycle and year 1 at the beginning of the next cycle. So again, if you're starting from year 0, so year 7 and 8 cannot be Me'aber Shana. Ibruha, however, if you in fact, if the Bezdin Taka did, you shouldn't have, but if you did, so then Hadreza Me'uberes, we see that it actually works. Now we're going to develop this idea as follows. What happens in a year of Shemitah? You don't own your field. Well, you don't own your field, so then you don't have to pay Meiser. What happens when the Chachamim put in another month in that year? You added a 13th month of Adar. You have to pay, you have to give Meiser on that 13th month? No, it's Bichlal the rest of the year. So if what we're saying is that in the Shnas Shemitah, that b'diavad, if in fact the Chachamim tried to institute an Ibur Shana, that it works, so that shows you that you can add a 13th month to a year. So instead of it being a year of 12 months where there's no Bailam over the property and no Meiser, they added a 13th month. So we see the Chachamim can add a month and there's no Meiser. Beautiful. That's what the Gemara says right here. The Gemara says, V'chodesh echad shu mosif lo pater mi Meiser. See, everyone would agree to that if you were in fact Ma'aber Shana, once the Brisa allows b'diavad for the Chachamim to add an extra Adar in a Shemitah year when you do not own the property, so you're going to be pater that year. So therefore we see that this is all part of that picture of Hefker, Bez, and Hefker, that in that scenario, the extra month would be pater from Maisros. So Ad Kadon Shviz, that explains the year of Shviz as to why we don't want to do it. We don't want to make the year any longer. Motzei Shvius Mai, what about the 8th year, the first year of the next cycle? What's wrong with that year? So Amar Rabbi Abahu, Rabbi Bon, Shelo Lerabos B'Isra Chodesh, because if you add another month of Adar, then the flour prior to the Korban HaOmer, which takes place on Tes Zayin of Nisan, so then that is going to be pushed off another 30 days. So then you're limiting people from flour access. So big discussion in the poskim about Chadash and Yashan and Chutz La'aretz. That's a discussion. As one of my rabbeim said before, you're makbid on, maybe you should be makbid on Chalav Stam and Chalav Yisrael. But before you do that, you should really work on Chadash and Yashan. That's a much bigger halachic issue than the issues of Chalav Yisrael. Either way, that was the concern about Motzei Shvius, about that next year. You've already limited everyone's crop. Halacha limited everyone's crop for the Shemitah year. And in the next year, they've been waiting so long to take advantage of their food. It's not nice to be Ma'aber Shana in the first year after a Shemitah cycle. Let people get to the Yashan quicker. The Hakrabas Omer on Tes Zayin Nisan will be pushed off a month if you add another Adar. Don't do that 30 days earlier. That's why we don't do it. That is answer number 1. Reb Zeira b'Shem Reb Elazar hada da'at amar, that which you just said, ad shelo hite Rebbe lahavi yerek michutza la'aretz. There was a time when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi would not allow for fruit or vegetables from chutz la'aretz to be brought into Eretz Yisrael, because outside of Eretz Yisrael, people were not makbid on burial plots, and they were not makbid on burial in general the way that they should have been. We were afraid that the dirt of Eretz Yisrael would have a din derabanan status. This was in fact the case, and we saw this earlier in Shas as well, that there was a din derabanan status on the dirt of Eretz Yisrael. So for a long time, apparently, Rebbe did not allow for vegetables to come in. Under those circumstances, that's when we said that in the Motzei Shemitah year, and the first year of the next cycle of Shemitah, that's where we had said that the Chadash was a problem. But once Rebbe was lenient, once Rebbe undid his Isser Derabanan and allowed for vegetation and vegetables to be imported to Eretz Yisrael, so then he shvis, he she'ar shenei shavua. Then that first year of the next cycle is like any other year, no problem at all. Tani, ein me'abrin, we said that you're not allowed to be me'aber. Amar Rav Mana, Amar, that which you said about Ein Ma'abrin, that was Birishona Shahayu Hashanim Ketiknan. That's when the years worked out nicely and all of the crops were grown by the time we got to Adar. Aval Achav She'ein Hashanim Ketiknan. Not clear from the Gemara why this is the case, but apparently all of the vegetation wasn't ready to go at this time in history. Maybe it's because their calendar wasn't well oiled like ours is. So we're pretty predictable. We can look at our calendar endlessly and we'll know exactly what day, but it was really not Pasha back in the day. Are we Ma'aber Shana this year? It wasn't so clear as we just saw. We don't even know. Shemitah years, 2 years in a row, you can't be Ma'aber Shana. You're going to be off a long time because the lunar calendar, the months move faster because the lunar year is shorter. So the year completes before another year, which means that all of the calendar is going to be off a little bit. So basically, at this time in history, that the vegetation is not ready. So then he shvis, He shiur shnei shavua, the same type of argument that we gave above about Rebbe's limitation about bringing in vegetation, importing vegetation from Chutz La'aretz. Here too, we would treat that first year after Shemitah like all other years. Tani shel Beis Rabban Gamliel Ibrua b'Motzei Shvis miyad, and in fact, because of this, Rabban Gamliel was of the opinion that on Motzei Shvis for that next year, they would instantly be Ma'aber Shana for that next year. And here is another approach. Amar Rabbi Avun, in min hada leis achma mina klum. If you are learning from this, then you cannot learn anything from it. Why? Because Shamor es chodesh sha'aviv. Because there, that's based on psukim. Everything is all the timing there was based on psukim. Shomrehu. We need to make sure that our crops are protected. Shevu b'chidusha, that the food should be ready by the time Nisan rolls around. That has nothing to do with svara. That has to do with agricultural clock. So it says Gemara, if that's true, where then do we learn the halacha that we were trying to learn here about hefker, bezd, and hefker? Says the Gemara, it's from the following. Because we have the halacha that says as follows: Gadish, if you have a pile of food, shelo lukat tachtov, that where the owner did not allow for poor people to collect the leket, so then there was a slap on the wrist. The halacha was that kol hanogos ba'aretz harei hein shelanim. Then, more than what the regular leket would have been that an ani could have collected, if you're not really following the halacha, you didn't enable the anim to come in and collect the leket. So then the halacha is that the pile that you made on top of the leket, every piece that's touching the ground now becomes leket. That's hefker, bezdin, hefker, right? That's hefker. The bezdin said that food now belongs to anim. So it says the Gemara of Amar Rabbi Ami, turning to the top of Gimel Amud Beis. Is that right? Amar Rabbi Ami, B'Shem Reb Shimon ben Lakish, de Beis Shammai. That works only according to Beis Shammai. So if you look at the Korban Ha'eda on the top line toward the end, in the long Dibur Hamaschil of Hachi Garsina de Beis Shammai, so in the actual text of the Korban Ha'eda, he writes, Vachi Perush Mas Nisan, Asya ke Beis Shammai. What does Beis Shammai hold? The Amar Hefker le'anim Hefker. If you're mafker something only to anim, that's still considered Hefker. But it's not true for the other vegetation. Beis Hillel says, no, you can't do that. You can't have your cake and eat it too. Continues the Korban Ha'eda, Lufikach Termin HaMaiser, Aval Ki Beis Hillel, Ein Lo Din Leket. No, you can't do that. You cannot convert only some of the food to be for poor people. Hefker aniyim is not hefker according to Beis Hillel. So that's a machlokas in the Tanaim. So back in the Gemara, Diki Beis Hillel, aniyim ochlenu ma'aser. No, it's not hefker. They have to be ma'aser. You're not just being mafker like Beis Shammai says. Amar le Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says, no, that's not really true. Shamanu shehu pater, even according to Beis Hillel, that it would be hefker, bezdin, hefker in such a case. Pater mi ma'aser. Why? Divrei Hakol, according to everyone, Mishum Knasa, because everyone agrees that there's a Knas here. What's the Knas? The Knas is Hefker, Bezdin, Hefker. You were not sensitive as a Balabais to allow for the Aniyim to come in for the Leket, and therefore you get a slap on the wrist that the whole pile is Hefker, Bezdin, Hefker. And this is the second possibility from where we learn Hefker, Bezdin, Hefker. And again, the first approach was we learned from the world of Shemitah. We said in Shemitah year, you can add a month. How can you add a month? If you add a month, there's no Meiser that you're Hefker, Bezdin, Hefker. And the Gemara doesn't like that reason because no, that was just a question of agricultural timing, and therefore they rejected that and took this secondary approach of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, the Knas of someone who does not appropriately give out their leket, and because of Hefker, Bezdin, Hefker, therefore the poor people can have it. And that brings us back to our Mishnah where we started, which was to say that when it comes to Kilayim, just to tie this up in a bow, that when it comes to Kilayim, the Chachamim do have the power to be mafkir other people's properties under the appropriate circumstances. And then when you look back at Halacha Beis where we started, we said that they were mafkir and kol hasadeh. All of that was done with appropriate guidelines. They had the latitude from a halachic perspective, just like Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel did with the Knas, to take away the property of others.
So the produce becomes hefker, but then it's part of Kilayim. How does anyone eat it anyway?
So no, separate sugyas. We learned from Beis Shammai about the leket, and we learned from that story that because they gave a knas, in that case of leket, unrelated to kilayim, in the case of leket, because the owner got a slap on the wrist for not allowing anim to come get leket, and hefker, bezdin, hefker, we see that hefker, bezdin, hefker works. Now that's our mari makom, that's our precedent in halacha to say that hefker, bezdin, hefker works. That explains how our Mishnah allowed us to say to some guy who was not makbid on kilayim, hefker, bezdin, hefker. We're just learning from the case of leket. The case of leket wasn't the case of kilayim.
The question is, if his field becomes hefker, Practically speaking, could anyone eat from Kalayim?
No, but you can get hana from kilayim. So people could take it and give it to their animals.
Right, so
And they were no longer, the Bailam had no rights over it at
He
all.
still owns the field, but the produce is after?
That's a good question. What is the case? I don't think it's the land. I'm just guessing. I don't think it's the land. I presume it's the produce. Yeah, not 100% sure, but I'm just a
And
guess.
essentially, what's the big deal? You just say, I'm reacquiring.
Correct. That's true. I don't know how they did it. Was it a hachraza in public and it was an onslaught of all the poor people to the? I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know how it played out. Daf Gimel Amud Beis Halacha Gimel Mas Nisan Bechamisha Asar Bo on the 15th of that month. Shulchanos, there were the money managers. Hayu Yoshvin b'Medina. There were people to collect all of the shkalim. Bekapei on the 25th of the month of Adar. Remember the deadline was Aleph Nisan. Just 5 days later, 6 days later. Yashvu b'Mikdash. They were in the Mikdash. Bishi Yashvu b'Mikdash. Hischilu lemashkein. When it comes to the time where they were sitting in the Mikdash by the 25th of the month. 5th of the month, so all the slackers who had yet to give in their chatzi shekel, they had yet to do their job. So then he's chilu lemashkein. Then they were forcing people to give it up. Esmim mashkenin. Who were they forcing to give up? So it says the Gemara, Levim v'Yisraelim, a clear omission of Kohanim. We're going to discuss that at length today. V'Gerim, v'Avadim Meshuchrarim, freed Avadim. Aval lo nashim v'Avadim v'Ktanim, but not women, not Avadim and not Ktanim. But the Cholkatan Shehischil Aviv Lishkol Al Yado, had there been a child for whom the father used to give Machzis Shekel, once he started that, so then Shuvei no Posek, he should not then stop giving on behalf of his child. Ein Mamashkin and Es HaKohanim Mipnei Darke HaShalom. However, when it comes to Kohanim, this Tanakama seems to hold that there is a chiyuv on Kohanim to give, but we're not mamashkin. We don't force, we don't twist their arms to make sure that they pay. We ask that they pay. We want them to pay. They should pay, but we're not going to push them. Ibnei Darkei Hashalom. The Gemara is going to argue on this point of Darkei Hashalom. Why doesn't Darkei Hashalom apply to everybody? Darkei Hashalom is just treating people nicely. What, the only Kohanim get that covered? Is that the mitzvah v'kidashto? The Kohen has to get the first aliyah? What is going on here? We'll see in the Gemara a little bit about this.
Well, they work there, so that's why they feel they're a little entitled.
It's not that what the Kohanim feel. It's the financial people who would say you're obligated to pay. Of course, they may feel. We'll see. What you're saying is hinted to a little bit in the price, a little bit lower. We'll get there shortly. So says the Gemara. Let's get into the machlokas about Kohanim. We're in the Mishnah here, about 10 lines down on Gimel Amud Beis. Says the Mishnah, Amar Rav Yehuda, Hei'id ben Buchri b'Yavne kol kohen sheshokel eino chote. If a kohen gives of the shekel, if he gives his machzis shekel, it's not an avera. What does that mean? It means that he has no chiyuv to give the machzis shekel. However, Amar lo Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, the great Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, low key, that's not correct. Ela kol kohen she'eino shokel chote. If he doesn't give the shekel, then he's a chote. So machlokas in the Tanaim, do we say that the kohen is or is not obligated in machzis shekel? Ella, what says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? What was going on? Says the Gemara, Shakohanim dorshin mikra zela atzman. The Kohanim looked at the following pasuk and they looked at it le'atzman from their own lens. There's a discussion here. Was this done with malice? Was it where they just really thought this was shot in the pasuk? Whatever the case may be, here's the pasuk. V'chol minchas kohen kalil tihya lo seachel. If there is a kohen who gives of his own money, so lo seachel, it should not be eaten. Ho'il. So they're looking at the psuk and they're like, well, if we're playing a role, is our donation private? Is our donation public? Are we really part of the tzibur as regular people? Are we not part of the tzibur as regular people? Is this a private donation? So because of that, they said it must be heach nechal, and it can't be that we're obligated. So it says the Gemara, we said that we don't force children to give. However, but we do ask children to give. We ask that children be represented by a chatzi shekel. So says the Gemara, when is that true? Hadad the Tamar, that which we said that we are toveya, that we ask a katan to give. That's not when he's 5 years old. It's not when he's 6 years old. It's only b'shehevi shtei se'aros, one of the simone gadlus, one of the simone bagros, that a child who has 2 pubic hairs, that child is considered to be a gadol of sorts. There's big shilas about this in halacha. Let's say for the Kriyas HaTorah, which is Deoraisa Parsha Zachor, is a boy who's Yud Gimel Yomim V'Yomechad, but he doesn't have Shtei Se'aros. So let's say he doesn't have any pubic hair at all. Can he lane? Is he considered a gadol mamish? So here we're saying that we're only toveya, we only ask a katan when he's under the age of chiyuv. but he is hevi shtei se'aros. So aval im lo hevi shtei se'aros lo beda. He is not a part of this halacha. And we said that we don't force him to pay. We don't force him to pay even if he has shtei se'aros. We do ask him to, but we don't force him to. So the Rishonim here point out that when it comes to developing children, there are a number of phases. Before the child is hevi shtei se'aros, nothing. Once the child is hevi shtei se'aros and he's not yet bar mitzvah, so then once the child is hevi shtei se'aros, then we are toveya. But says the Gemara that we don't force him to give. And the Rishonim here point out until he's 20. Until the child is 20 years old, we're not mamashkin. This has a Mari Makom later in the Gemara today, which indicates that only when the people were counted as the pikudim, like we say that if you're between 20 and 60, so that's how we counted Klal Yisrael. With the men aged 20 to 60, 600, 3,550 by Har Sinai. We counted only age 20, so that's implied here as well. Says
when you're eligible for the army.
Right, exactly. For the halachic army, yes. Keni mas nisan, the machlokas here, what does Keni mean? Anyways, there's a similar Mishnah to our Mishnah that says, Ein memashkin in kohanim. What did we say in our Mishnah? We said, Mibnei darkei shalom. What does it say here? Mibnei derech hakavod. Totally different answer. And this was, I foreshadowed this a little bit. The darkei shalom applies to everybody. But there is a special din of kavod that Taka does apply to a Kohen. So this is it's a divergent approach to our Gemara, to our Mishnah, which said that it was because of Darkei Shalom. We're not focusing on Darkei Shalom here. Here we're going to be focusing on Derech Kavod. 2 dots, middle of the page. Amar Rabbi Yehuda said, he said that Ben Bukhari of Yavne had said that a Kohen is pater. Says the Gemara halfway down, Gimel Amud Beis, Amar Rav Brachia, Haimadur of Yochanan ben Zakkai, Zeh Yitanu. The pasuk says Zeh Yitanu, Gematria, Zion plus Hey, 12. Yud Beis Shvatim Yitnu, all 12 Shvatim. The Kohanim were part of Shevet Levi. All 12 Shvatim have to give. So that is the Shita of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who argues on Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said he's a chote if he doesn't give the shekel. He's obligated to. Whether or not we force him to is a din and kavod, but that's a separate shaila. He still is a bar chiyuva. He's obligated to give because of Zeh, Zion, and Hey, all 12 of the Shvatim.
Isn't all these Shekalim is for a population count? So
but it also was for kapara. And if they're going to bring korbanos to the parashas of the korban atami, then you want it to be yote. So afal pi that you're a kohen, it should count for you too. The fact that you're working there doesn't solve the problem. If you want kapara, you have to be giving in. You have to pony up. So that's yes. It had a double purpose for sure. But one of them was kapara, and without that, the korban tamid wouldn't help you. Reb Tavi b'shem Rav Hamnuna kain meshivin chachamim. How would the Chachamim answer the Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? What would they say? Chatas Yachid Mesa, Ein Chatas Tzibor Mesa. So the halachos are different for a Chatas Yachid and for a Chatas Tzibor. Minchas HaYachid Kreva Kalil, Ve'ein Minchas HaTzibor Kreva Kalil. What we were concerned about is that they were going to give with the wrong intentions because the halachos are different for a Minchas Yachid versus a Minchas Tzibor. It's very difficult for the Kohen to give with this selflessness that is only for the Tzibor without any personal intent, and that might have an impact on the Korban. Says the Gemara, there's a side problem with this, and that is as follows. Because if you look at this, it says, Rabbi Yehuda. This is not a problem for Rabbi Yehuda because the kasha, the source that you just raised as a question, doesn't make sense. You're asking a question against Rabbi Yehuda, but he doesn't even agree with the premise of your question because he holds not like you. It's not in the Mishnah, right? She'ein chatas tzibur mesa, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Tammuz. Your whole argument was the difference between chatas mesa and chatas yachid. Rabbi Yehuda is entirely not on the same page. You're arguing from a Mari Makom that he doesn't even agree with. But without even bothering to answer that, the Gemara goes back to its question. It says, V'umosivlan, what would Rabbi Yehuda answer? Zulo nidvas yachidi. This is not really going to be a nidvas yachid. The problem is that the Kohanim are not going to be giving in a pure-hearted way. Maybe it's not possible to give purely for the Tibor when you're one of the Kohanim. Maybe it's hard. Ve'inun misivinan le, how would Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai answer? Kevin shenimser letzibor kemi shehu nidvas tzibor. No, we just assume halachically speaking that once you give for the tzibor, your own intentions are not going to be the overriding factor. The primary factor is that you gave to the tzibor, so that counts. Steve, the pasuk writes, "Kol ha'over la pikudim." This was also something that I mentioned a little bit earlier. What does it mean, kol ha'over la pikudim? This is a machlokes. Rabbi Yehuda Rav Nechemya. Chad Amar kol da'avar b'yama yitain. Anyone who left in the yam, who crossed through the yam suf, they're the ones who are obligated to give in the shekel, namely everybody, even the kohanim. that would be, of course, a more inclusive shita. V'charna, the other one, Omar, he says, Kol da'avar al pikudaya yitain, anyone who's going to be counted in the pikudim, which is above the age of 20. Ma da'amar kol da'avar b'yama yitain misayeh l'Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai. The one who says that everyone who walks through, that's a shita of Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai, and man da'amar kol da'avar al pikudaya yitain, that anyone who is of age should give, that's Misayel ben Bukhri. That's like the Shita ben Bukhri, who says that not everyone was necessarily included in the requirement of the Machzis HaShekel. We'll stop here at Halacha Daled, and we'll pick up in Yirtzeh Hashem tomorrow night. I'm hopeful to do a blot and a half tomorrow, in which case on Shabbos we'll also do a blot and a half, and it'll be evened out for Friday. There is a chance that that won't happen, and if that's the case, then we'll be a little bit behind until after Pesach. Throughout the Yom Tov of Pesach, all 3 days will be 1 hour before Mincha. I think it's in the 540s each of those 3 days, something along those lines. And if anything significant changes, I will post in the WhatsApp group and let you know. Wishing you all a beautiful.
Hey, on